to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you lead more confidently and make a bigger difference, both professionally and personally. This episode is brought to you by Kevin's Daily Newsletter. The Daily Newsletter is a short email delivered Monday through Friday, written to inspire, engage, and focus you on becoming the best person and leader you can be. Learn more and sign up at remarkablepodcast.com/daily. And now here's your host, Kevin.
When we recorded this episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast live, we had some connection and recording trouble at the very beginning, but thankfully only at the very beginning. After my guest joined me, we had no problems and could continue. So let me introduce our guest, and then we'll dive right in. Our guest today is Larry Robertson. He's an innovation advisor, helping people discover value at the nexus of leadership, entrepreneurship, and creativity. He's a Fulbright scholar, a popular columnist with Inc. magazine, The Creativity Post, CEO World magazine, Smart Brief, and others. And he's the award-winning author of 3 books, Rebel Leadership, The Language of Man, and A Deliberate Pause. Welcome, Larry. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's my pleasure. We got people coming in. Ryan's in Los Angeles, and Sue's in Florida, and Teresa's in Philadelphia, and I'm sure there are more. So welcome to all of you and everybody else. Now that you've used the chat, you know that you can ask your questions along the way. And all that really means, Larry, is that I'm really not in charge here, which is really probably better for everybody. But let me just get this started. I mean, I don't know that I've ever had a guest who called himself an innovation advisor. And I'm guessing when you were 6, you didn't say, I want to grow up and be an innovation advisor. So tell us a little bit about your journey, Larry. So how do you end up doing this work? How did the work find you? How did you get here?
Yeah, it's occasionally I meet somebody who says that at 6 years old, they knew exactly what they wanted to do and who they wanted to be. I think I'm in that vast majority that did not. But where I've landed is really this amalgam, this combination. You might think of it as a quilt of experiences over time. And early on in my career, I was lucky enough to go with a group that I really didn't know what I was going to discover there. It was a small venture capital firm, investment bank that did things differently, meaning than other venture capital firms and other financiers. And the key thing they did differently was they spent a lot of time with their prospective clients before they were clients, no charge, learning about them, listening to them, hearing their story, and then coming back to them and saying, here's how we think we can add value that goes way beyond money. And I loved that environment. I loved learning about people who were building something really amazing. I loved figuring out where they might have a blind side or might need additional help. And then I loved figuring out how to bring true value to that situation, or when you couldn't, being able to say that and not try to sell something that they didn't need. And so I would say that those were really the roots of this path that I've gone down, where an innovation advisor to me is a combination of my advisory work for sure, but I also do a lot of research for my books primarily. I then share that information in lots of forms, book, article, speaking, and so on. And it comes back into my advisory work. So it's this circle that continues to feed itself. And frankly, that's the nature of innovation and creativity. It isn't I've got this problem, I need to solve it. It's really living in that practice and that habit of thinking in a creative way. So that's really my background.
Well, thank you for that. So now you can see, Larry, we've got people from around the world, from Asia, from Europe, from the Middle East, and even from the United States. So I want to raise a question. The first word I said was uncertainty when we started, and it's in the title of this session. It's in the title of this podcast. It's in the title of your book, How to Thrive in Uncertain Times. So I really want to start with that premise, because it's almost a cliche that things are changing faster than ever. So I'll just say, we don't need to bore people with the details about why that might be true, but rather I want to ask the question, why are things more uncertain, more changing than ever, Larry?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think there are lots of reasons why. For example, we are a much more interconnected world than we ever have been, and in the past 20 years, that's been in fifth gear, full throttle. We continue to be more and more connected. As a result, we see more information than we used to, and that includes things like risk. And so we see these elements that are out there that might have stayed at a distance from us in the past, right in front of us, affecting us. The additional uncertainty is that everything we do, whether it's communicating, it's creating those risks, it's helping one another with those risks, amplifies whatever's going on in our individual lives, if that makes sense. So risk and uncertainty, those are things that we used to think of as periodic or episodic, that a risk is going to come along. It's going to start in the distance. It's going to come towards me slowly. I can figure out how to avoid it or how to leverage it. I have time. And I think the distinction in this kind of uncertainty is we really don't have that time, and it's not episodic. The uncertainty is ever present. I refer to it as our new abnormal. And so the key part, I think the interesting part, is whether or not you can arrive at acceptance of that this is the environment we live in. This is the new abnormal. If you can, there's amazing opportunity in it. People often think of uncertainty as a threat, and really sometimes it's the ingredient or the mojo we need to think about things differently, or to look at what we're already doing and not necessarily change it outright, but to think about how we might tweak it or evolve it or make it as effective as it was before, or more effective than it ever was. And so that's really the field that I'm playing in when I talk about uncertainty.
And I love that thing you said. I'm going to go back and sort of verbally underline it for everybody. When you said that, hundreds of people are saying, well, there's more information than ever. That's not new. The insight that you gave, I think, is especially valuable, is including risk. We see more risks than we ever were aware of. So at least at some level, it isn't necessarily that there are more, but we're more aware of them because the information coming at us from every direction. I mean, I think it's a really, really valuable thing. And I think for us as leaders to think about, how do we manage that and understand that? But, we've got teams of folks that are all experiencing that. And so the anxiety, the frustration, the worry, that comes along with all that, I think is really, really powerful. And Larry, I'm not sure I've ever had anyone say, I don't think I've ever heard it quite that way before. I think that's really, 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 really excellent. So you also said something about the new abnormal. You sort of threw that phrase in there, and
Yes.
You talk about it in the book a little bit. So anything more beyond what you already said that you want to add to that phrase? The reason that it strikes me is because my co-author, Wayne Trammell, has been using this phrase a lot. So I'm just curious if you want to unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, I'll just say two quick things. I mean, the key one is what makes this new abnormal the dominant force is that uncertainty keeps coming, and in a variety of forms. So it keeps things from settling into what in the past we might have thought of as a normal, a status quo, a business as usual, what have you. That's harder to come by. So it's this constant shifting and this constant evolution. But to relate it back to the risk element, it we're more connected than just digitally connected. Everything that we do has a ripple effect. It's almost like that butterfly effect across the world. The butterfly moves its wings and it creates a hurricane somewhere else. That creates not only a very different kind of risk, but two forms of risks. There's conventional risk. That's the kind we're used to, and I briefly described that. Gives us time to adjust to it, and we adjust to some kind of new normal. And then there's this complex risk, and that complex risk comes from that more greater level of connectivity we have, where the risk created in one place starts to weave over or intertwine with the risk created in another place. A lot of the risk is taking place underneath the surface. So even the way we think about risk and calculate risk has to shift in this new abnormal. And it's reprogramming your brain to think in that way, that it's going to stay abnormal. Now what do we do with that? Rather than to think the old way we did, which is, I just need to get to a new status quo and then I can cool my jets for a while.
Well, and I think just we get better at dealing with it simply by realizing that that's it, right? Just simply realizing that we're not going to have these long waves, right? Where we're going to get a chance to cool our jets, take a breath or whatever. Just knowing that we're not going to be back there. Perhaps that's the key to recognizing this idea of the new abnormal. Now we're talking, in case you missed it, we are talking with, I'm going to get rid of that maybe if I can get smart here. There it is. We're talking with Larry Robertson, the author of the new book, Rebel Leadership, How to Thrive in Uncertain Times. So we've been talking about this whole uncertainty piece of that. And what I want to do now is help you frame the rest of our conversation, because you say that there's such a thing as a rebel leadership mindset. And so I'd like you to tell us what that is, because that's, I think, the starting point for us to talk about and think about, okay, we've got this uncertainty. Now what, right? So how would you describe or define for us this, what you call the rebel leadership mindset?
Yes. So I think of rebel leadership as a new term altogether. And it's really built from the best of the sum of its parts. So to explain that briefly, the rebel that I'm talking about is the person who's open. It's the person who is conscious of how things are shifting around them. They're willing to try new ideas. They're experimental. All the ideas in the experiments are not just theirs. They're open in the truest sense of an innovator. I mean, there are some negative connotations with the rebel who is just a risk taker for the sake of risk taking. That's not what I'm pointing to in the rebel part of this new term. And the leadership part isn't just one person at the front of a line, the top of a pyramid, and has a bunch of followers. The leadership I'm talking about there is the person who realizes that the real job of a leader is to create an environment where everybody can lead and where everybody is both encouraged and emboldened and empowered to lead. So when you put those things together, we're talking about an innovative, open, thoughtful, adaptive culture, right? That's exactly what you need in uncertain times, in which we don't just look to one heroic person who's going to save the day with all their ideas and all the answers and all the leadership. Instead, we look to a collective. And frankly, if you live in a new abnormal, if you have new uncertainty coming at you every day, that is not a one-person job. It really takes a collective to be able to deal with that effectively. So that's what rebel leadership means in the context that I write about it. And the mindset is, these can't be one-offs. You have to live and breathe that culturally as an organization, as the person who happens to have the highest title in the stack. It has to be something that's ongoing and therefore part of your mindset.
So if that's the mindset, and I think it's somewhat self-evident, but I'd like you to unpack it a little bit more. Like, how does having that perspective, having that mindset, having that belief set help us to thrive in uncertainty, which is what we sort of promised at the top that we would talk about today, right? Like, how does that help us do this?
Yeah. So if you think about how I'm going to go about thriving in uncertainty, ultimately I've got to get down to a handful of simple things that serve as my ongoing guide. Why? Because if the conditions are changing, then most of your assumptions are going to change over time too. So if you say, I've got this formula for dealing with an uncertain world, and I'm going to go do battle with that same formula all the time, I would say, good luck. Because if the world continues to change, the formula is based on certain assumptions, it's got to change too. So when you make this your mindset, let me give you a simple example. People often talk a lot about purpose, right? Or in a group setting, sometimes they talk about shared purpose. But we tend to treat things like purpose or shared purpose as let's get that down on paper in this great group meeting. Let's frame it and put it on the wall, and then we go back to our day-to-day jobs. When you're talking about a rebel leadership mindset, you're taking that shared purpose, and number one, you're allowing everybody in the organization to help shape its meaning. Two, you're using it as an ongoing reference point, not occasionally, but every day in every decision, every action by every single person. So you're using it as a bellwether for what your actions and what your language and what your people are doing right now. Is it really in line with the purpose that we're trying to go to? So I give that as a simple example, but just having that there as a constant reference point encourages you to continue to be aware of the uncertain environment and to figure out how to adapt, but in this consistent way that always links back to this thing that's been co-created by everybody in the organization.
And that is so powerful. The shared piece of it, I think, is of course powerful. But this idea of it being the thing, the talisman, the touchstone to decisions, to actions, to language. I love the fact that you included that in there, as well as decisions, the work itself, processes that we follow, all of that. In fact, that takes us probably to another thing we could talk about, which is culture. Right. It's one of the big chapters in the book talking about culture, the importance of culture. So where do you want to go with that idea, with the word culture, in terms of this conversation? I'll let you.
Yeah. So
take the lead there.
I'll tell you exactly where I want to go by telling you what others told me who are having to answer this question every day. So I interviewed a lot of people for this book, including Russell Schaefer at Walmart, he's one of the heads of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Walmart. And Walmart makes a big deal about culture, right? As many organizations do verbally. But Walmart is really trying to create something with culture. In fact, they think of culture as their chief competitive advantage. So Russell was the perfect person to say, well, that's great. What does culture actually mean then, if it's going to be more than just words and if it's really going to be this competitive advantage? And Russell made it very simple. He said, culture is who we are and what we do right now, right in this moment, not who we were, not who we aspire to be, but a litmus test for all our actions and decisions by everybody across the board in our organization. So if you think about that, you're I don't want to say weaponizing, but you're turning culture into this instrument by which you decide how to do your work, by which you measure the value of the work you do, by which you measure the need to improve from there. And you're getting this information from all these different angles. That is so rare that people go beyond talking about culture. There are surveys that are done regularly where they ask senior managers, middle managers, employees across the board, do you think culture is important to your organization and to your ability to succeed? And the numbers are off the charts. I mean, in upper management, they're in the mid to low 90 percentiles.
Mm-hmm.
And when you get all the way down in the organization, it never dips below 85, 87% that say, oh, yeah, it's absolutely important. And then you go on to ask all those individual groups whether or not culture actually comes into what they do, whether or not they can define it, whether or not it links to the goals that have been set for them. And the numbers just fall off the charts, except for senior management who's saying, well, I told them what culture was, so I've done my job. And what we find is that for those organizations that actually use it like Russell has described, it's a litmus test for everything you do every single day by every single person. It works, and it's enormously powerful. The other thing I'll say, Kevin, is leaders are often afraid of culture and embracing it in detail, especially sharing it and allowing others to define it, because it signals to them a lack of control, that you're giving up control to the masses and who knows what I might get back. And the most interesting thing is for those organizations that initially feared that and then leaned into culture, they thought of it as a cliff initially, right? Once I step off this and I open it up to my entire team, my entire organization, in Walmart's case, 1.3 billion employees across the globe, it's going to be chaos. And what they've all found consistently is it's more like a curve. So it doesn't mean that stepping off doesn't mean some change or awkwardness or even conflict in belief about what the culture should be, but how it levels itself and then how it orients itself into something powerful moving forward. It comes fast and it comes easily.
So I'm writing that down, curb, not cliff. But I want to I want to make an observation, and that is we started this conversation talking to everybody. And so those of you that are here with us live, if you've got questions or observations for Larry, please put them in, and we'll ask him those questions. But Larry, we started out talking about uncertainty, and we talked about why uncertainty is real and why it's so prevalent and all those things. And yet what we're saying now is we're looking at things like true purpose and the reality of culture as what I would call intentional culture, as the foundation that can keep us from falling as the sands shift, right? So it gives us something to stay stable with. It gives us that litmus test so that even when things around us aren't the same, we've got something that is the same that we can hold to. And that is so powerful for us psychologically, individually and collectively. And
yes,
that's what's striking me as I'm listening to this conversation.
No, you're absolutely right. And I'll amplify what you just said, Kevin. We are a species that is built for uncertainty. So if you think about the evolution of humans over time, this doesn't mean we're perfect. We don't make mistakes. We don't do stupid things. But we have constantly dealt with uncertainty as we have evolved. And so a lot of the things we're talking about are really returning to, well, how are we able to deal with uncertainty? What gives us our greatest advantage or our greatest strengths? And the kinds of things we're talking about, right? Like that shared purpose, having how you cope best built into a culture, expecting change to continue to come. And there are other things. That's really going back to the core of who we are and what gives us that ability to continue to evolve. And guess what? We've always done that collectively. I mean, we love the hero story, but the hero rarely saves the day in any kind of lasting way. They've either been supported by others or they are passing it on to others who extend the value they create. So it's a real collective exercise. So a lot of this is really returning to who we are as human beings.
Perfect. So there's a story that you share in the book, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot too much, but I think there's a really powerful mindset lesson that you share with us from the ranchers in the Australian Outback. And clearly I misspelled Australian. So I'm going to take that away. But talk about in the Outback, and I'm a farm boy, so I love the story. But so frame that up and share that because I think there's real powerful value for everybody in that particular example.
Sure. And let's follow the same path we have in the conversation so far. When you're in the Australian Outback, you are talking about a deeply uncertain landscape. So it's wide expanses. It tends to be very dry, although the weather runs the extremes. And so ranchers who are raising livestock, let's say cattle in this instance, they have to allow their cows who are free ranging to explore a lot of land, but they don't want to lose those cows because those are their assets. So they really come down to two options: the fence strategy and the water hole strategy. So the fence strategy says, well, I know my cows and I know my land and I know where they're going to roam. I need to build a fence around that to hold it all in. So they're looking at that uncertainty in their environment and they're trying to exercise some degree of control through the fence. But fences are not foolproof. Fences are expensive. Fences take ongoing repair. Sometimes cows get past fences and so on. The water hole strategy is the opposite of that. It says if I create a water hole, then those cattle are going to be drawn to it because as much as they roam far and wide to graze on grass and plants and things like that, they need water too. So they're going to come back on their own. Am I going to lose strays here and there? A few, but really by allowing that open strategy that occurs around the watering hole, allowing those you're trying to control to actually exercise some control themselves. And I'm talking about the cows here. It actually is a more productive and effective and even economical way to ranch. And this is a true test that's been done in the Australian Outback. And that doesn't mean there aren't people who still use the fence strategy, but the open strategy is a pretty powerful way to start thinking about how we deal with uncertainty.
Well, and so it doesn't even say that one is necessarily better. What it says is we've got that the choices that we make come back to the way we view things. So we go back to this mindset piece, which is what I think there's something for us to think about that goes far beyond the Outback, first of all, and far beyond even which one's going to have us lose the least cattle. It comes back to what's the operating principle that we're working from, leading from. And I think that's what makes it so powerful. And I believe it's the kind of thing that could leave you thinking for a long time, which is why I wanted you to share it. So,
And I love that last part, Kevin, by the way. It's an image, right? And so it doesn't even matter what you and I say about that image. Your listeners can take that image of the water hole versus the fence, of the open versus the closed, and play with it themselves as to how it might apply in their own work or lives.
Yeah, and Sue says it's a great analogy. Sue, I agree with you. But the beautiful thing, it isn't just an analogy, it's also real, right? Which makes it even more, I think, powerful, other than like, it's sort of like this or like that. So there's lots of things, Larry, that we could talk about. I know that that's true. But since you are a person who's thinking about the future, the last section in the book talks about what you call looking at the long view. So I'd like you to help us think about, from your perspective, first two questions really. What does that mean for us to be a rebel leader, or to create rebel leadership? But also, what are you seeing right now as we look into 2022 and beyond for us to be thinking about?
Sure. So to the first part, when I refer to the long view here, I refer to that thing that most of us talk about and then think about as a someday goal. We'll get there someday. And the organizations that are thriving in uncertain times are saying, no, the long view is most important right in this moment. So if I'm not incorporating that into every day, much like if I'm not thinking about purpose or culture, those things every single day, then the chances are that the long view goal I have, excuse me, will continue to recede into the future. And I might arrive at it in part, but never as robustly as I hope to. And I think the way I think about the long view right now is this idea that if you look, first of all, back over the last 20 years and you see how the uncertainty is growing, and then you look forward as far as we can possibly look forward, it isn't going to change anytime soon. So the long view in my mind has a lot to do with, can you accept the reality and the environment around you, and then set your goals within that and realize that in order to hit them, you've got to be touching and playing with those goals every single day, and you need as much help as possible. So that's how I think about the long view.
Beautiful. So we've been chatting for about 30 minutes, Larry. And the question is, you might be saying, well, Kevin, I wish you would have asked me this. Like, what else? What didn't we talk about that you wish we would have?
The only thing that I would really add is, we talked about shared purpose, and I made a point of emphasizing how important it is that that is something that the collective defines and tests and evolves over time. But before you can do that effectively as any individual, you need to have a similar sense of that about yourself. Now, I distinguish it. I don't call it purpose, individual purpose or something like that. I refer to it the way that hundreds of people I've interviewed refer to it. It's your soul. And soul, in the context I'm talking about, is what is your identity, but specifically within the context of what you do and how what you do connects to and impacts others. So think about this. That part of me, that identity, can be played out in a lot of different ways towards a lot of different purposes. But that sense of who you are and how that plays into what you do and your connection to others is a critical thing to play with, to have a sense of, not necessarily to have a full handle on, not necessarily to spend hours deeply thinking about it, but to have some sense of it, because that's what you bring to the collective. That's what you bring to the shared purpose. And if you don't know your own soul, it's really hard to contribute at the level that each of us is able to contribute at.
That we're capable of, right? Yasmin asked a question, and there's a lot that she's written here. I'm going to try and get to the heart of the question here for you, Larry. She says that she believes that she and her organization are already practicing rebel leadership as you're describing, and meeting so many challenges. The question is, how and where does she find comfort in all of this uncertainty and all the challenges?
Yeah. So everybody has their own version of what comfort means. So for some, comfort is you can finally put stakes in the corners of the tent, and it's not going to move anymore. And the news isn't good on that front. Things are going to move. But I think that if her organization is already trying to address this together, there are two things that I would suggest that it was Yasmin
Mhm.
do. So the first is to make sure that her sense of self, that soul part that I talk about, is clear to her. And maybe it has been clear and it's just time for a check-in. That would be one key thing. And then I'll flip to the other side, right? So there's Yasmin and her soul. There's the organization that's focusing on this. Then there's the outside that the organization is impacting. And so to the extent that her organization is not asking those that are outside, customers, partners, new employees as they come in, whether or not they think that the organization is hitting on all cylinders, is being truthful with itself. Sometimes we forget to do that, to look at who we're ultimately trying to impact, to put it more bluntly, to look at the who cares end of what we do, and to ask those we want to care whether or not we're connecting with them, that our purpose is sharing beyond our immediate group. And sometimes you find that those tension points are on that individual level or that external level. And if you address those, it actually brings a great deal of comfort.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Larry. Now I'm going to shift gears. We're almost finished. So my question for you now, sir, is what do you do for fun?
I'm glad you asked that question. I'll tell you a quick story that's even better than what I do for fun, which includes body surfing and hiking and kayaking and things like that. For my second book, I interviewed nearly 70 MacArthur Fellows. These are the folks who win the so-called Genius Award. And when I got to the end of my interview with one of them, Pablo Sanchez, he said, I said to him, "Are there any questions I haven't asked you?" And he said, "What do you do for fun?" And I immediately started to say, "I kayak and I body surf." And he said, "No, that's the question you didn't ask me." So what I will say, which I hope your audience already knows, I just want to amplify it, is this is one of the most important questions you can ask. And talk about a source of comfort. It's a source of renewal as well. So when I do those things that bring joy to me, it's also a renewal to go back and deal with the uncertainty.
Perfect. One of the things that I do for fun, not that the question was asked of me, but one of the things I do for fun is to read. So this question that I just asked, I ask every guest, but I also ask this question of every guest, which is, what are you reading? What's something that you're reading or about to read or recently read?
Yeah, a book that I'm deep into right now is called Beyond the Trees, and it's written by Adam Schultz, Shoalts, and it is about his one-person expedition to canoe across the upper Arctic, above the Arctic Circle. And I'm fascinated with that area, and I'm also fascinated why anybody would ever choose to do that and what they learn from it. And in a similar way, this is the book that's next on my reading list. It's called Life Lived Wild, and it's by Rick Ridgway, who's one of the key folks in Patagonia, was part of the first team of Americans to summit K2. And it's really about his life lessons, including those expeditions and those duties that I just described. And I love to listen to others reflect on what they've learned from things that I would never step up and do.
Perfect. So, Larry, the question you wanted me to most ask is, where can people learn more about what you're up to, connect with you, etc.? I'll hold the book up, Rebel Leadership, while you do that. Where can people get a hold of you? Where do you want to point people?
Yeah, the best place to find me is at my main website. It's my initials, lrspeaks.com. And you can learn about the book, my advisory work, my speaking, my articles, all of it right there.
And there it is right there. lrspeaks.com. So now a question for all of you before we go. The question I ask you every week, which is, now what? What are you going to do now? What actions are you going to take as a result of this? Not just what did you learn or find interesting, but what are you going to apply? I've got lots of notes here for myself to think about in terms of complex risk. And the quote, status quo is harder to come by. Now, see, all that's wonderful, but really it's, what am I going to do with it? And the question for you is, what are you going to do with it, because ultimately that's what will make the biggest difference. Larry, thanks so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for your great questions and for this opportunity, Kevin. It was my pleasure.
So before we go, everybody, let me just tell you that if you loved this and would you like some inspiration and information and ideas and innovation in your inbox each day, you can join me for what I call my daily email. 500 words or less, all for you and for your success. Just go to kevineikenberry.com/daily to sign up for free. Hope you'll do that. And I hope you'll be back here next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.